I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing an issue that affects the whole world, the issue of mass migration. Let me put my cards on the table. Unlike most people who regard themselves as liberals or leftists, I'm wholly opposed to mass migration. The reality is that the mass migration of people from poor countries to rich countries makes the poor countries poorer and the rich countries richer. It denies to the people of the poor countries the skill, the drive, the energy, the talent of the people who've left, and, of course, whilst making capitalists richer in the rich countries, it actually depresses wages, puts pressure on precious resources in public services in our neoliberal Western countries. Most people on the left don't like to hear me say that, but it's an ironclad view that I have held all of my life. Being a champion of the working class, my first responsibility is to the working class in my own country. The question of refugees, on the other hand, is wholly different. Every country in the world has a legal and moral responsibility, duty, to accept genuine refugees and in a fair distribution, which we currently, of course, don't have. Added to that, the countries that created most of the refugee flows are the countries that take the least refugees. The countries which had no interest in the wars, occupations that have littered the 21st century are the ones taking millions. Others argue about hundreds and thousands. There are virtually no refugees in the United States of America. There's next to none in Britain, though a big hue and cry is made about 100, 200, 500 arriving on southern beaches from France in rubber dinghies, those that don't perish in the cold water on the way. Having said that, not all of those people claiming to be refugees are in fact refugees. They're economic migrants, like my own grandparents were economic migrants. There's nothing wrong with being an economic migrant. If I was living in Afghanistan, I'd probably be an economic migrant also. But the receiving country has a responsibility to its own citizens, black and white, wherever they came from, whenever they came, has a responsibility to its own citizens to manage and control inward progress of immigrants. So this is a vexed question, but it is setting the political heather on fire all over Europe and in Britain, which doesn't, as I said, take any significant number of refugees at all. But governments like Greece, Italy, Spain are now being shaped by the public response to the real or perceived inflow of people from Africa, from North Africa, from the Middle East. This is worth making this point, although again, many will not like to hear it. The vast majority, some 80% of the refugees that were recently on the Belarusian-Polish border, were from Iraqi Kurdistan. There has not been a war in Iraqi Kurdistan for more than 30 years. In fact, Iraqi Kurdistan, just like Kosovo, are in fact NATO protectorates. They're ruled by the Western countries to which the people there are in significant numbers seeking to flee. For whatever reason, it's not because they're fleeing war being dealt out by the West. In fact, the West has effectively occupied Iraqi Kurdistan since 1990. Uncomfortable facts, but facts nonetheless. But hey, I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. I'm joined by a group of distinguished experts who probably do have very different points of view to mine. We're debating here today mass migration. Who's at fault? Is it local governments or is it foreign meddling, war, occupation everywhere? Let's start with Dr. Siana Shafi, because she is a distinguished expert, spent time at the front line in Greece and elsewhere of the influx of refugees. She's a general practitioner, a doctor. She's the founder of Kitrinos Healthcare, but also someone who's looked after the health needs of refugees for many years. Dr. Shafi, thank you for joining us. Mass migration, refugee inflows, whose fault?
My goodness, George, thank you for the introduction. I don't know if I'm an expert. I've certainly experienced it as the child, you could say, of an economic migrant. My father chose to leave Sri Lanka in the 70s, which was beginning to war, poor little island in the Indian Ocean. And he often tells us how he left with $30 in his pocket because he knew he wanted a better future for us, his children, 3 of us at the time. And I came to this country as a first-generation Sri Lankan daughter of a Sri Lankan obstetrician gynecologist and a general practitioner. My mother was a general practitioner too. And so I sort of think of that, and I think, well, you know, I'm here. I came for education. We paid to get the education that Britain was offering us. And part of me feels a little bit uncomfortable about your description because I could foreseeably fall into the category of the kind of the better educated, more, if you like, elite class of Sri Lanka who left poor Sri Lanka. But I don't feel guilty because I know for a fact that if my parents hadn't done that and we hadn't come here, he hadn't left, we would not be in a position at all to support any of our 50 or so relatives, main relatives, and their own families and individual families with education. You know, we've managed to educate them in the countries they live in. We've managed to fund their living, housing, etc. And it's not just about money, you know, it's about skills, and I think you touched on that. Now, so when I'm on the field, it's a different situation, and I think when I first went out there, I went wondering who I was going to see in Lesvos. So I started in 2015 in the peak of the refugee crisis in Greece in particular. Hundreds of thousands of people crammed into a space in a farm, in an olive grove really, that is known as Moria, a detention centre and a registration centre. It's where boats were landing. If we remember the summer of 2015, that's what our television screens here in Britain were filled with. But I was curious about the types of people I was going to see. I thought it was going to be the people from Syria primarily, and I think this is what the Greek government thought too at the time. It ended up being, of course, people from Syria. I think the majority at the time were, a significant proportion from Afghanistan, quite a proportion from Iraq, and these would be your top 3 priority countries. So I was surprised to hear you say that Iraq is kind of protected, because I don't think
Iraqi Kurdistan.
Kurdistan, but certainly they were Kurdish.
Not Iraq has been decimated, but Iraqi Kurdistan was part of the decimation.
Yes, so there were Iraqis and Iraqi Kurdish people in Greece.
Carolina Graterol is a journalist and an artist with a passion for contemporary art and politics. But she's also involved in fundraising for sections of the global population, like the Palestinian people, for which there is not a lot of competition. There are not many people clambering to let more Palestinians in here. And there are not many people who pay much attention in Europe to the flow of refugees and economic migrants from Latin America northwards until they end up in cages at the hands of Donald Trump and then the very same cages, Joe Biden. What would you say, Carolina, first of all, to set your stall out on this issue of mass migration?
Wow, it's obviously a situation that has been exacerbated by the policies, the foreign policies of countries in the West. We need to understand that what happened in Libya, what happened in Syria, in Iraq, it's product of that policy of fear, of revenge that Bush, Blair, Aznar, President Aznar in Spain supported 20 years ago. And that has produced the mayhem, chaos that we have seen in those countries, and with the resulting of people trying to cross the sea to reach us. This is a crisis made in the West, in the rich countries. And I think because of that, there is a responsibility, a moral responsibility of those countries to take.
Well, should Venezuelans take to the highways and leave Venezuela? Or should they remain in Venezuela and try to build it into a better society? Should Cubans get on a rubber boat and head for Miami, or should they stay in Cuba?
I think the situation with Venezuela is a very particular one, because in the case of Venezuela, there hasn't been a bombing of Venezuela, there hasn't been a war there, but the Venezuelan people and the government, the country has been confronting a hybrid war that has affected the economy, as being a psychological attack, convincing people that they have to go out of the country to get better life. And the main thing is being the attack to the currency in the country by creating a web page in Miami that was giving you a completely wrong reading of the value of the Venezuelan currency against the dollar. But that value was absorbed by the country and affected the whole economy. So this is a completely different...
I know that, of course, but should the people leave or should they stay?
Well, the Venezuelans left because people with salaries couldn't really feed their families. And this is the migration that we have seen there. What we have seen there now is that because the attack was against external attack against the economy, and the economy really has continued to produce, they're coming back now. So.
Well, the same is true, of course, Julius Mbaluto, journalist and broadcaster, radio host. The same is true in Syria, for example. Millions of Syrians fled because of a war fomented by Western countries, paid for largely by Persian Gulf countries. But should they stay in the cold north of Scotland, or should they be going back to Syria to rebuild it?
Let me put it this way. The president of Syria, we went to the same university in the UK, City University. He's alumni for City University. When I joined, when City University wanted to brag and say what kind of people we produce here, you know, they used to talk about him. He was in all the magazines and stuff. Since the war began in Syria, they stopped featuring him. And the thing is, when you look into the dynamics of the war in Syria, it was him clinging on power, being backed by Russia and a few other countries. But then again, when you talk about the Western form of democracy, which has to be seen to work there, you have other countries also bombing Syria. Now, can you imagine, when you're on the sky on some plane, how do you differentiate who is ISIS in Syria from the ordinary Syrians? It's a very difficult thing to ever grasp. And a lot of people have died through that war. And you see, one of the things when kind of in a way I don't support your view when you talk about mass migration is that People never leave their country because they want to. People leave their country like Syria because there's war. Most vulnerable people, women, children, they're fleeing for safety. And also, let's also not also mix that and think any refugee is a poor person. Syria was awash with millionaires before the war started. You may have even have wonderful rich people who had banked their money in safe havens. Maybe they had also private jets. When war began, they had to flee war in their private jets. They're not poor. They banked their wealth in the West, safe havens. The same story when you go to like countries like Africa. Africa, you have countries with billionaires, right? They have private jets, they have all these choppers and whatever. But when war breaks, it's a matter of where is it safe for me to go? It's not about am I rich or am I poor? Now, what maybe you escalated into finding that when you say poor people leaving a country to be poor because, you know, maybe they were clever, they were dynamic or whatever, they fled because they were fearing because of war. But brain drain maybe is what you're talking about as well. Brain drain.
Well, I certainly am.
Exactly,
I mean,
exactly.
Dr. Shafi is a perfect example, and her family is a perfect example. A GP, an obstetrician, whose daughter is a GP and an intellectual. This makes Sri Lanka poorer that they are here in Britain. Let's hear from Salman Javed in Pakistan. He's the Director General of the PAC Afghan Youth Forum, because of course millions of the world's refugees are Afghans, and most of them are not in Britain but in Pakistan. Salman.
You're welcome.
Who's at fault for the problem of migration from deprived regions?
Well, there can be many factors involved in the migration, or people becoming refugee in other countries. That can be famine, that can be war, that can be a conflict, that can be a climate change factor over there. But in the modern world, mostly it is because of the war and conflict that people are getting displaced, or people are leaving their homes and getting refuge in the other countries, or migrating to some other countries. That is the one main factor which is driving people or pushing people towards this phenomena of getting asylum in the name of political or economic factors. And those people who are perpetuating those wars or conflicts, or those stakeholders, be it a regional stakeholder in any region, or in any extra regional stakeholder from around the world, they can be straightforwardly blamed for such kind of phenomena that is taking place in the world right now. There are about 82.4 million people right now who are getting migrated, who have become the immigrants or refugees in other countries. It's a huge number right now.
Let's focus on Afghanistan, your area of expertise. Can we say that foreign countries, like, say, Pakistan, have a share in the responsibility for the existence of huge numbers of Afghan refugees on the border of your country?
Okay, now look, in Afghanistan, the war over there is going for like 50 years. It's been 50 years now. It's not a war which is there for last 20 years, but 50 years. Back in 1978, the Thor Revolution took place over there. The Thor Revolution was a preamble for the Marxist revolution, or the Marxist forces that took over in Kabul. And then that was the first instance in Afghanistan when people started to flee from the country, and they started taking refuge in the neighboring countries, in Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asian countries. And that was the first time when Pakistan started hosting these refugees. Pakistan was not directly involved in any kind of conflict within that perspective. After that, when the Soviets came into Afghanistan, Pakistan became again the first line ally of that war against Soviets over there. And we started again taking refugees from Afghanistan, and became the country who is right now on the officially on record. We are right now hosting around 1.4 or 5 million refugees, And unofficially, there is a number of 3 million refugees, or 2.5 million refugees. So Pakistan was more of a victim of this conflict, not the country which is behind this misery of the Afghans. But yeah, there is a great game going on. There is a strategic intent of some other countries around the world and in this region as well, who would want to keep Afghanistan in a turmoil, and keep Afghanistan as a buffer zone, as a battlefield. So they may pursue their strategic interests over here. And among those countries is the United States. It can be before that it was Soviets, then United States came in. For last 20 years, in the name of war on terror, we have again seen a huge influx of refugees, both in Iran and in Pakistan.
In simple words, who should be blamed for that situation?
Right now, it's Americans, because Americans came over in last 20 years, and they claimed that they are coming over here to install democracy over here, and replace a radical format of governance from Afghanistan. And they also said that they will be restructuring the governance model of Afghanistan. They will be putting in some structure which will bring in the rebuilding or rehabilitation of Afghanistan back to the country. But what happened in last 20 years, that they could not produce a single solid structure inside Afghanistan which could produce something good, produce something better for the people of Afghanistan. As soon as the American forces pulled out, Afghanistan is about to collapse now. So yeah, the foreign power, the Americans, they are really to be blamed for this crisis which has been brewing in Afghanistan right now.
Most of the Afghan refugees are heading for Pakistan and Iran. Can you make a comparison between the numbers going to those two countries and say to the European and NATO countries that made war on Afghanistan for 20 years?
Right now, Pakistan is the second largest country who is hosting the refugees around the world. Turkey being the number one, Pakistan being the number two, and then there is Uganda and Sudan, and then on the fifth or sixth number, we can see that Germany is there, holding around 1.1 million refugees over there. This is the data that I'm quoting from a UNHCR report from 2020. Right now, after the pullout of American forces from Afghanistan in last August, around 37,000 people on daily basis are leaving Afghanistan in one way or the other, and they're going to either to Iran or to Central Asian countries or to Pakistan. And mostly they're coming to Pakistan because our border is more open to them, and we are trying to facilitate them as much as we can. So again, if you see around the world, Western countries, they have taken a few 12,000 people on their planes to America and some other Western countries, to Australia or to European countries. Only 20,000 people.
Only 5% of Afghans have the surety that they have enough food to eat tomorrow. That means 95% of them don't. We'll be discussing far more of this after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but talking about the world, in particular, the world flow of more than 85 million refugees in the world right now. And most of them are refugees in countries almost as poor as the countries that they have fled from. Dr. Shafi, the Afghan situation, it's particularly egregious, isn't it? The United States, Britain, NATO bombarded it, occupied it for 20 years. Then they scrambled away in the middle of the night, returning to power the same medieval obscurantists that they had driven out 20 years before. And they have done so without any preparation for a bitterly cold and hungry winter for, as I said earlier, 95% of the Afghan population who don't know if they're going to eat tomorrow.
Indeed. I mean, shocking, but not surprising, you know, considering how I think, I mean, I wasn't born when all this messing around in other people's affairs began, but I can certainly understand, and I suppose I awoke late into the world of politics and how interfering it can be sometimes, you know, and basic bigotry ultimately, because we in Britain, so if I speak with my now British hat on, we do see ourselves as very elite here, and you know, this is where the reduced number of migrants allowed to the country. When my father eventually came here to Britain, he didn't come here straight away, by the way, and I will get back to you on the brain drain thing as well, but when he eventually came back here, get this, he came here on a skilled migrant workers permit. They needed him here as a skilled obstetrician gynecologist. So taking a step back, I would almost think, I'd like to think myself a bit like the coronavirus. We're actually citizens of the world, no matter where we were born, where we were brought up. I have actually had the experience of 4 countries, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and then here. But I'm not the only one. That's not very unique nowadays, because a lot of people go and work in a lot of places, taking their families with them. And it is the way it is.
Yeah, but it's a one-way flow, isn't it? I mean, the health service is filled with people who have come to Britain from poorer countries. That means they're not in the country that they were born in, and that the health facilities in the country that they were born in are commensurately reduced. It's a zero-sum game. The more people we take from poor countries with skills, with brains, with drive, entrepreneurship, and so on, the poorer the countries that they left are going to be.
Okay, let me respond to that. That depends, okay? Because it depends what the people who come here do. It's true that, yes, if we come here just for the glory and the money, yeah, then let's just end it there, you win. But if those people who come here then take more responsibility, open their eyes, as I did, as my father has always done, and think of it as a tool to get trained, to get skilled up, and then you can do 2 things. You can support someone else to get trained, or you can teach someone yourself. My father's actually a lecturer at several universities across the world, including in Sri Lanka.
Julius, Africa is a case in point. When I was a child, as a Roman Catholic, we used to put pennies in a black doll that ate them. They were called pennies for heaven. Africa was regarded as a poor place. Insofar as it was poor, it's because the empires that you talked of earlier stole a lot of what they could carry, including people, as slaves. It turns out Africa is vastly rich, vastly rich. So all I'm saying is, let the Africans stay in Africa and make Africa boom. What's wrong with that point of view?
It's not a wrong thing to say.
No, it's a
but
great
you see, Africans can stay in Africa. But will the Europeans stay in Europe? See, the thing is, as we are talking in today's world, right? We are living in a global village, global world. It's all about trading with each other. It's all about mutual agreements being struck. It's all about UK wanting to strike a deal to build some road projects in Eritrea or whatever.
I wish.
And we have all
That's
these...
China. You're confusing us with China.
No.
We don't build road projects in Eritrea.
China.
We give money to the TPLF to destroy Eritrea and Ethiopia. That's a different approach.
Yeah. The thing is that neither Africa will stay on its own or the rest of the world, because there's mingling, there's trading, there's diplomacy, there's living in a one world. The only problem we have, especially in terms of Africa, no matter how much Africans want to stay in Africa, and it's fast rich. Yeah, they've got minerals, they've got all these things. You know, every mobile phone being produced, the key mineral is coming from DR Congo in Africa. And it's everywhere in the world. Talk about the gold in Dibos in South Africa. And when you see these things are actually a reality. So
yeah, but
the question is...
But what you're not grasping is that this doctrine of globalization, globalism that you are championing, is being rejected by the mass of the working class in Europe because they say we want actually to have our own culture and our own country. We don't want to be part of a world in which nation states disappear.
But who encourages?
Let me use a metaphor. Let me use a metaphor. Let me use a metaphor. If you want to live on a highland, you don't throw stones from the highland to land on the mainland. You're provoking people. They'll come and find out where is the stone coming from.
Yeah,
but I think it's the poor. I think working class people here have been fed the idea that it's because of the immigrants that the services are collapsing.
They have no agency. Are they stupid?
But the thing is, if you look at the figures, it's not the immigrants that have collapsed all the services here. It's austerity. It's a policy designed by the Tory party to reduce, to close nurseries, to close libraries. That didn't
and is that
happen
made easier by 3.5 million white Eastern Europeans living in the country?
Still, I said the austerity has reduced these services.
Yes, but that's a given.
And these
scorpions sting because they're scorpions. Conservatives destroy public services. But having destroyed them, do those services get less or more pressure on them by 3.5 million white Eastern Europeans coming to live in Britain?
Well, they came to also produce goodness and richness for this economy. Some of these people are skilled
I'm surrounded by liberals here. Let's see if... the thing is, I know the country from a different perspective. I know it from the northern working class masses. And they see things very differently from the metropolitan middle classes here. Let's take one of those. His name is Charles Kelly. He's an immigration advisor, a writer, and a director at NVQ College. Let's hear what Charles has to say.
My pleasure.
Who should be blamed for the problem of migration from deprived regions?
I think there's a very big question, who should be blamed? It's a combination of economic factors, of wars, of invasions. I mean, if you're talking about the Middle East, then there's clearly a trail there back to Bush and Blair. But that's not the only place where we have migration from. So it's a big question of who could be blamed. I think that the current wave of migration is part of a wider change in society, and I think it's more than just where there happens to be a war. I think the internet has opened up a big world for people now, where they realize, well, we can just go to these countries. When I was working in immigration, they would apply, and most of them would get turned down, but they would apply to come here. If they couldn't get here on a work permit, they would come here as a visitor or student. Not all of them would go back, but at least they entered the country illegally. Now we see, millions of people just walking into a country, and perhaps this is down to the fact that they can look on their phone and say, well, there's a better life for me somewhere else, as people have done through the centuries. And why should I be here hungry and in under war conditions or in danger when I can just go somewhere else? So I think there's a big change going on, and of course, I mean, there are various pushes and pull factors involved here. You've got the push of persecution, violence, war, and you've got the pull of a country like Britain of safety, stability. You've got the push of things going wrong in your country, maybe lack of opportunity, whereas you've got the pull factors here of jobs, of a better environment, healthcare, education. So you can't blame people for wanting to make a change. But there's been a big shift since I was doing my immigration work in 2000. There's been a massive shift in the way people are coming into the country through Europe and now through South America. But who is to blame? That's a big question. I think the current wave in Europe definitely has traces back to Tony Blair and George Bush.
I mean, many people say if there were no wars, invasions by colonial countries on these poor regions, there would be no need for a refugee outflow.
I do agree with that. But I think in terms of asylum applications coming into Europe at the moment, not all of them are coming from the Middle East. Not all of them are coming from Iraq and Afghanistan. About 30% are coming from African countries, where I would say it's more economic migration. I mean, a think tank called DER described the 4 causes of mass migration, and one of these was opportunity, but there was also survival, persecution, war, and just violence on them. So there's various pull factors. So you can't trace every migrant back to an invasion, although a lot of them did come from the Middle East. But that's certainly a big part of it. Yes, I agree. But there are other factors involved. I'm not trying to make any excuses for the invasions. They were wrong, but that's part of the migration pull. A lot of it is economic as well, you have to say.
Surely the luring of the brightest and the best from these poor countries to migrate to already developed and rich countries deprives their own countries of their skills and expertise.
Well, that was always argued when I was involved with nurse and healthcare recruitment, that you're depriving people. But then you can't say to someone who wants to come here, well, stay where you are and earn low wages and very few prospects, because we want you to help your country. In most cases, the people we were recruiting did not have jobs in the country. I'll give you an example. The Philippines, they train far too many nurses. They haven't got jobs. In order to get even registered as a nurse, to get that license after they've done their training, they have to work in a hospital. They have to pay the hospital. They're not even giving their services free. They have to pay some of the hospitals to give them work experience so that they can get registered. And then there's not a job for them at the end. So how can you say, well, stay there and help your country, when most of these nurses are now working in call centers? And I mean, that's one of the reasons why we wrote the book. Yes, this How to Come to the UK was to say to people, you can find out yourself how to come to the UK legally, rather than going through some more unscrupulous methods. But yes, of course, if you take all the doctors away from the country, there will be a shortage of doctors. But the individual also has a choice in the matter. And many of these people have actually trained and paid for their training with a view to going abroad. I think I read in the UN that the numbers of people overseas in some form of labor is now 164 million. So those people have obviously moved for a reason. That was back a couple of years ago, by the way, but those people have moved for a reason.
You've been helping migrants for many long years. What moves people to risk their lives in rubber dinghies to reach Europe, to reach the United Kingdom, to reach the United States?
Yeah, well, obviously people in Britain would point to France. People in France would point to Britain. I think it's a combination of things. It's I wouldn't say all of these people have actually just come from a war-torn country. Some of them are just economic migrants. They're paying a lot of money to fixers and traffickers. So the traffickers certainly have a part to play. I mean, these people who sunk in that boat were put into a boat which was totally unsuitable for crossing the channel. But I was looking at the figures of asylum applications, and in the UK, people tend to think, and the press think, that we get too many. But in fact, most of the asylum applications in Europe are made to Germany and France. Germany, I think a year ago was about 120,000. France was 93,000. Greece was 40,000. So a lot of the people do make their applications in Europe before they get to, they get through Europe on the Schengen visa, so they can travel through Europe without being checked. And then they get to France, and then there's this 21-mile strip of water. And, they want to get across to the UK for various reasons. Maybe they have family here. Maybe they think they can build a better life here. The language is here. They speak English. Perhaps they've heard that, when you come here, the streets are paved with gold. I don't know. But in fact, I think our applications in 2020 was something like 29,000. Now in 2021, I believe 20,000 people have made their way across on boats, but it's certainly less than make applications in countries like Germany and France. The other thing I wanted to say is that perhaps these people have no other way of making an application where they are in their country because the embassies are not there. It's very difficult to make an asylum application for a country you're already in. But this is a very complex area to sort of put your finger on one. I mean, certainly in the UK, they have Royal National Lifeboat people who are volunteers who actually go out into the sea and rescue boats that are stranded. And the border agency virtually guide them in and say, here we are. And, they don't stop them coming here. I think the French seem to sort of just put them on the boats and wave them bon voyage. So there's a lot of political aspects to this, but I don't know who is actually to blame in general. You can't say pinpoint one person, but the people traffickers certainly have a lot to answer for.
Carolina, why are we using this word blame? Blame implies that there's something wrong with it. Are you in favor of open borders? Do you believe that in this one world that has been talked about, people have the inalienable right to go anywhere in the world?
I think it's not a question of open borders. It's a question of making sure that each country has the possibilities to develop an economy that's strong. And that depends a lot on the international markets, how United States, affects countries like Venezuela, for example, with this hybrid war and the mayhem they are creating in our economy. I think if you play honestly rules and countries can progress and develop, those people won't want to come or live. They want to be in the countries. I think anybody who leaves a country is, as you both said, is because of this situation. When you cannot live, you cannot feed your family. What do you do?
What's wrong with the situation? My own view is this. Britain needs immigrants. We need them for our economy. We need them for reasons of family reunification and so on. We should prioritize immigrants from the Commonwealth, partly because we stole all their things, partly because there is a cultural, historical affinity that didn't exist with Bulgaria and Romania and so on, and that we have a responsibility, never mind our right, to manage our migration. That's nothing wrong with that, is there? That policy? That's my policy.
There's nothing wrong with that. The only thing is that in today's world, whatever ends up being formulated as a policy for immigration definitely has to reflect on the history that's there, because history is key to everything else. Like you mentioned, Commonwealth, there's historical ties between Commonwealth members of states. This deeply rooted history that you cannot do away with. And with that history as part of heritage to all the countries involved, you cannot wish it away, but the best thing is to make it work. And the ugly parts of history, you find out how to manage them. Because right now we have different generation of people. We don't want to always, like anyone from former British colonies, they see people from England or UK and they are thinking, you colonizers. We don't want that. We are like, These people are not responsible. They were not even born during colonial era. Why should they be punished for the sins of their grandfathers? So we are living now. We need to make our world better from where we are. But we have to pay attention to history because you can't discount it. You can't ignore it.
But we can't do it, Doctor, if scores of millions of people are cascading around the globe. If 6 billion people want to come and live where 2 billion people are living, that's not sustainable. And no government, by the way, would ever get re-elected if they were giving a green light to that. That's just hard electoral facts. In fact, far-right parties in Europe are rising on the tide of this problem. Exaggerated as it is, as we just heard on the screen, Britain's taking 29,000. Greece is taking 40. France is taking double that. And Germany is taking most of all. But virtually no one in Britain looks at it that way. They think all the refugees in the world are headed for us. So there are real dangers in 84 million people on the move, because with other things like global warming and so on, that 84 million might one day become 840 million. And then we'll have real trouble.
I certainly have very strong views on this concept of nationalism, because I experience what you experience, that most people I met in their travels in Greece, you know, they were all passing through Greece. They weren't the 40,000 who were accepted to stay there. Most of them wanted to go back to their home country. I even had Syrians who said, wow, if this is what life's going to be like in a military camp in Greece, I think I'd rather just go back. And some did, sadly. And one of the comments, for example...
Why sadly?
Well,
all Syrian refugees should go back to Syria and rebuild it.
Well, let me tell you what he said. He said, at least they'll know what to do with my body when I'm found dead somewhere. Yeah, they'll know the right thing to do, whereas the bodies found in Greece are sort of against barbed wire, probably on the borders of Gaza, probably the same. I think, look, imagine a place without borders, okay? This is, for me, probably the way we do need to go, because the thing, my second point I didn't say earlier was that our skills is one thing, and our financial ability, it depends now what the individual chooses to do with it. I think we as individuals need to take responsibility.
But we as a country have a right to decide whether we want you to come here and do your own thing, don't we?
Well, you're talking about here, but I'm saying the people, the intelligent working class, the poor people, the rich people, we all have the right to help the government do the right thing.
Yeah, but do you have the right to go and settle and work in any country that you like, is the point I'm making. Do you?
I think you should be able to, depending on what you do with your skills and your earnings thereafter. So there should be a sense of responsibility.
Well, let me tell you, when I was a trade union official in a factory of 3,000 people, when I went in to negotiate with the manager for better wages for that 3,000 people, if he could have said to me, I've got 10,000 people that have arrived from Sri Lanka outside who'll work for half what you're demanding, so you better cut your demands or leave, and we'll bring in a cheaper workforce. Do you really think anybody in this country is going to vote for that?
Well, I think that's disgusting on two counts, not just because the locals were dismissed because of cheap labour, but why should the Sri Lankans be paid less, assuming they're Sri Lankans? Why should they be paid less? Well, we should be paid equally. We're no less capable.
Do you know how factory owners think? Factory owners would put a robot in the place of the human if they could. They'd put a cheap worker from Bulgaria in place of an expensive worker from Scotland, where my factory was, because that's what factory owners do. We live in a capitalist world.
Of course we do.
I would
yeah.
very much like it to be different.
But I
Last word
think
to you,
there
Carolina.
is a case of this company I'm not going to mention who was trying to get rid of 2,000 employees and basically started looking for them. And the people, young people knew about it. They flooded the site. They crashed the site. They couldn't hire the people they wanted to replace with. So I think it's organized by us, the people who
So
they want to
fought
play
for the right
against.
thing. They fought for the right thing,
people,
right?
exactly.
The
If my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle. If Britain was as you've just described it, and so was France, and so was America, was as you've just described it,
It happened in this
we wouldn't be
country.
having this discussion.
It happened in this
No, we
country.
wouldn't. We would,
It happened in this country.
Yeah, well, I don't know where it happened, but it certainly don't happen every day in every part of this country. The reality is, if a large number of people show up at the door offering to work for less, the boss will take the offer. So we need a managed immigration system. We need people to shoulder their responsibility on refugees, and proportionately, even disproportionately, I would say that Britain has a bigger responsibility to take Afghan, Iraqi, Syrian, Libyan refugees, because we were right in the front line of attacking, invading, and occupying their countries.
Totally.
But there's a difference between a refugee and a migrant. I know that because I sat in Parliament for almost 30 years representing people who were claiming political asylum. And most of the time, although I did my best for them, they weren't actually political refugees. They were people who wanted a better life, just like my grandparents did 100 years ago. It's been a marvellous discussion. We've sharply disagreed. It's been 3 against 1, actually. But I think it's made good television. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة on Al Mayadeen Television. Thanks for watching.